It was how I ever started recording before you came in there, so that's going to look a bit weird. Never mind. It's part two, so it should be all right. Yeah, so we were in mid-flow there in the societal one, and I was saying how where are we? Um, hmm. I was saying how like that Thatcher wins over those aspirational working class voters on her education policies in the 80s, because that's one thing where if you're looking at it purely traditionally, I think the Conservatives can make a key argument they're more progressive on education opportunities for the working class. For obvious reasons, because generally, if you're more successful, you vote Conservative. So the more people they can get out of the working class into the middle class, the more voters they get. On a purely cynical level, but I think the aspirational aims of the Conservative Party are also for educational opportunities.
That's I guess none of the students would know keeping up appearances
Probably
with
not. They might look it up.
it's a British comedy, right it was in the 80s, late
Yeah,
80s,
yeah,
90s,
hmm
about precisely that kind of person.
yeah,
But the whole joke of that series is that she's from working class background. She's a sort of aspiring middle class. She's very middle class, I guess.
yeah,
But her sisters,
yeah.
then married to working class guys, so they're constantly trying to raise themselves up.
hmm
Uh,
Yeah, to look outside. So, I mean, and obviously the other key factor is all these social policies were brought in by Roy Jenkins. So he was the driving force in the Labour Party behind this. In the same way that, Butler was doing everything under Churchill. Like he was basically running the show under those Conservative leaders. This time Jenkins was the driving force behind these social changes. And that's quite important because he leaves, obviously, the Labour Party in the 80s, doesn't recognise him, becomes chose to form the SDP, which causes issues outside in the 80s. But at this point, he's introducing all these social policies. So how much Wilson should get credit for something that was driven through? Obviously, he did still sign off on it, so that's still important. But these were Jenkins's
yeah,
policies that he was driving through. But I don't know, like how effective you want to lead off. How effective would you say he was on social issues?
I think it's easy to argue that he was effective.
Yeah,
I think I would frame this in the fact that he actually, he wins the next election by a much larger margin.
in 66. Yeah, although some of these
Yeah.
policies don't come in until after that election win, so there he does lose
Ooh,
the 70 election. And I think some of this,
correct.
but
That's right.
I don't think this is the major. It's a tipping point for some voters, but I don't think it's the major reason why he loses in 70.
Yeah, so I would say I think out of all of the issues, if you wanted to really emphasize his effective leadership, I think the societal one is the easiest. I think the second and third points, managing the Labor Party and the foreign and colonial issues, are more problematic.
Yeah, and
Uh,
economics, if we then add that afterwards as
and then
well.
economics, yeah,
Yeah, economics, I think. And the key with social, I would say, obviously he's effective. I think he creates modern Britain. I think that basically these social reforms he makes are the base of what I recognize as the UK, but what people in the 60s may not have done. But like what I grew up in the 80s and 90s is the world he created, or that Roy
yeah,
Jenkins created out of this. Because there
yeah.
aren't many people that would even consider any of these things to be stuff they would want to bring back. You know what I mean? If you're
I don't
looking,
know, James. As I say, I think it was. I think this was the sign of the times.
yeah,
We're in the 60s. There was a big social transformation going on,
yeah,
independent of political leaders, and this
yeah,
is true in other places. It's true in
yeah,
the United States, for example, as
yeah.
well, with civil rights
But he
happening.
gets all these through. Like, look at abortion; it's still a question in the United States. So is contraception
Yeah,
still a question? Racial discrimination
yeah,
still a question in the United States. Death penalty still a question in the United States. Equal, you know what I mean? It's
yeah.
like and all of these issues are still hot button issues in America. No one, there is not a nowhere near a percentage of British people that would want to overturn any of these.
Sure, sure. That's fair enough.
So
Okay.
I think that's where the difference is to America. America's conservative wing and society is like in that sense, socially conservative is far stronger than anything in Britain.
Absolutely.
Britain is
Yeah,
very liberal socially. The
absolutely.
difference
Yeah.
in Britain between conservatives and liberals is mostly on economics. It's not really on social issues.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
And I also
Um,
think it's why Britain is not a fertile ground for the culture wars and why they've never really kicked off here because there just aren't any people that give enough of a crap to like bring it up. So I think that the Americans will have a harder time exporting their culture wars here, even more so than I think in Europe, because I think you can export. There are some of these issues are still problematic in mainland Europe, but I don't think they are here.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that,
Yeah,
but I don't want to digress too
yeah.
far.
All right. So the second factor then was managing the Labour Party. So
Mhm.
he gives cabinet positions to both wings of the party, left and the right. Quite a sensible move. Operating from the look, obviously looked at Gateskill. I always say the ones who learn from their predecessors always win elections. So he learned from Gateskill where he failed to unite the party, and he obviously would have learned, he would have learned of Attlee and the way Attlee handled it. So uniting the Labour Party is no mean feat. He gets only 4 resignations in his term, which is similar to Macmillan, and he managed to hold the party together to survive only a 4-seat majority, which is incredible for a Labour politician because they get overridden quite a lot. But they'd still not resolved the differences between left and right, and that manifests itself in the election. But we'll jump in here because you're looking at Wilson spectrums overall. And I should bring these things forward into this really. In place of strife in the Vietnam War caused real big problems.
Yeah.
That's treading upon foreign and colonial issues. Probably you want to combine these two with managing the Labour Party because you can put foreign and colonial issues and I would bring in economics as
Yeah,
well.
because that's the foreign and colonial issues are really important because it leads to a split, doesn't it,
Yeah, I think that
between the
that's the main thing.
factions?
So actually, on hindsight, looking at this essay pack, I think I should reorganize that because I think managing the Labour Party and foreign colonial issues should all be one, and economics should be
Yeah,
the third one. Because also,
yeah,
in place of strife should be in here for managing industrial relations. So let's just go into that while we're here. Like in place, and then we'll talk about foreign and we'll kind of group these two together, and we'll add in place of strife. So in place of strife really upsets. Like the trade unions are a bit out of control. Wilson needs to get hold of them. Barbara Castle designs the policy in place of strife as a white paper. They bring it in. And the idea is to
yeah,
rein in the union control or rein in the unions. Of course, that upsets the left wing of the party
yeah,
because they're like the trade unions provide most of the funding for the Labour Party. They've always been Labour's strongest supporters. They're wondering why they're being reined in. And then Wilson eventually U-turn. Callaghan sides with the unions, puts pressure on him here, which causes their divide, which then splits the Labour Party left and right again. And then Wilson then backs down on it, which upsets the right wing of his party, which is again, so in trying to, he'd been really successful at straddling the divides in the party, but he does stuff in this era that reignites the divides by trying to appeal to both sides. He can't really because it's just impossible to keep this piece together. And
yeah,
that
yeah, exactly.
manifests itself in
Yeah,
Vietnam as well, where he supports the war publicly, which annoys the left, but doesn't send any troops, which annoys the right, as
yeah.
well as annoying
Right.
America. But obviously, this is Britain's way of putting it like a kind of like a kind of assertion of their independence of American policy and a kind of
It's a bit like,
revenge for Suez.
yeah, an interesting parallel with that
Yeah,
is the Biden administration's policy towards Israel,
yeah,
I think,
yeah,
where they on the one hand try to placate their more left-wing base by
yeah,
suspending shipments of arms and
yeah,
trying to,
yeah,
censoring Israel. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, continuing to send them weapons.
yeah.
Um, and so you kind of end up in this very tricky position where, in a way, you just make everybody angry.
Yeah, but I think war is particularly difficult to deal with for a left-wing party.
Yeah,
Like they just
it
can't
does. Yeah,
deal with it.
and of course, in
You see that with
Vietnam,
Blair in Iraq
yeah,
and with other stuff. It's
right.
never the case. It's really
And
difficult for a party to deal
and
with.
in Vietnam, it's even worse because it's the communists.
Yeah, yeah,
The far left of the Labour Party has communist sympathy, so of
yeah,
course they wouldn't
yeah. As we
that
know from the
object
50s era.
that object that they would absolutely object to Britain supporting the United States.
Yeah,
Um, so that's a tricky one. Yeah.
yeah. So I
So
think
I guess the two main issues, if I could sum it up, the
yeah,
one when we're talking about managing the Labour Party, it's really the unions,
yeah,
what to do with them.
yeah,
They seem to have a lot of well, like unions seem to have an incredible amount of leverage.
yeah,
I mean, the pay increases they're asking for seem just phenomenal
yeah.
when you read this on the page.
Yeah, and
And if
that
they don't
leads to
get
inflation, which means they then need to call for more wage rises, and you just spiral the
exactly, it's
economy.
a really vicious cycle. It's a
Yeah,
really vicious cycle, and if they don't get the pay raise, then they go on strike,
hmm
which also increases inflation, makes things more expensive.
Yeah,
So that's tricky too.
yeah.
So
Keynesian
we've got
death
the
spiral.
yeah, exactly. That's right. So the unions and Vietnam seem to be the two
Yeah, and then
difficult.
Southern Rhodesia as well, because it
Yes,
as
yes,
it's a
yeah,
legal declaration of independence from Ian Smith, he struggles to deal with it because again, he's trying to balance both sides, and De Gaulle, like his party's divided on Europe, and he doesn't get De Gaulle is still like over my dead body, you enter the EU, which leads to Heath getting his big win. But like the divisions on Europe, divisions on Vietnam War, divisions on In Place of Strife, and I think of the three, I think he could have ridden the other two out, but In Place of Strife is killer. You know, dividing your
yeah,
party on the unions when that's already
absolutely.
your weakness in the public eye is a bad idea.
So in place of strife, it was meant to be a policy that reined in the
Yeah, I
unions,
think it
that
was one
made it
eye
more
on the
difficult.
election to like rein them in. Also, he knew like the economy was spiraling out of control. They weren't able to
Yeah,
handle it, and a lot of that was to do with the unions' wage demands and other
yeah,
problems.
yeah. So you can see the motivation because he needs to do something. He needs to be
Yeah,
seen to do something. He
yeah,
can't, he has to be conciliatory to some extent towards the unions. So it's
yeah,
not. But of course, the unions are in such a strong position that
yeah.
why would they accept those terms?
Yeah, but they've got that position because again, the post-war consensus is based on nationalization and the unions having the right to work.
Yeah.
So you can, until you, and that's where Thatcher breaks that when she comes in. But until that happens,
Yes,
no
yes,
one's
yes.
challenging the right for them to exist or run stuff. It's just how much power do they get? So only really
Yeah.
comes in and
But
changes
I think the proof of
reality.
their power is with Heath.
Yeah,
But Heath actually isn't able to manage them either in the
no,
Conservative
no,
government.
no, and we'll
I
talk
don't
about
think,
yeah,
and I think that suggests that that's not necessarily Wilson's fault. I think
no.
he's in a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
one thing with Wilson. It's like when you're judging him, how much could he have done in this 6 year period with the economy as
Exactly.
it was?
Yeah,
And
you can't make him responsible for all the inflation, for the economic downturn, for the union strikes.
no,
You know,
but
you
he
can
does
only
make
judge him about
decisions.
how well he manages it.
Yeah, I think you can judge him on his decision on Vietnam and on and in place of strife.
Yes, yeah. It seems like and with Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. So
Yeah,
this is a really interesting. I encourage your students to look up this example. I don't think it's that. Is it very well known in Britain?
probably not.
Um, the fact that Southern Rhodesia, it was ruled by a kind of white minority, and when it looked like there was a chance that Britain would grant Rhodesia its independence,
And we should
he
say Southern
decided this
Rhodesia is now what is
Southern
Zimbabwe.
Rhodesia,
Yeah,
Zimbabwe,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
yeah. One of them, Ian Smith, just declared the country. He said, well, it's going to declare the country independent of Britain.
yeah. To declare to
Um,
keep white rule because Britain
to
wanted
keep white rule
to give
in Southern
democratic
Rhodesia.
rights
Yeah,
to black voters if they got independent. Yeah.
it's astonishing. It's actually an astonishing circumstance. It's extremely embarrassing to Britain.
I'm sure it
Yeah,
probably prolonged apartheid in South Africa as well.
probably, but I don't think Ian Smith. I don't think. I'm sorry, not Ian
Yeah.
Smith. I don't think. In this case, I don't think Wilson handled it that well. I think he was lucky with this one.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't think he got
I,
any. I mean, did he handle anything effectively on foreign policies? I think if you're looking at managing the Labour Party, he obviously did it really skillfully at the beginning, and then he either lost his touch or
yeah,
it was just impossible. The question is, did he lose his touch, or is the Labour Party just impossible to control?
yeah.
And it's
No,
like,
but
oh,
sorry. Just to finish on Southern
yeah,
Rhodesia. So,
yeah,
what do you do when you have a former colony declare its independence from you, and it's a white minority that's trying to hold on to its power and its prestige in
yeah,
this country. And so Wilson tries to, some people I think in the Labor Party are saying to Wilson, you need to send in troops
yeah.
on the ground to suppress this rebellion, which
Obviously,
is to be amazing.
the right wing of the party,
Um,
I'm assuming.
but I think Smith sort of prevaricates and tries to negotiate with,
Yeah,
not Wilson tries to negotiate with Smith.
yeah,
And it's extremely lucky that Smith they didn't make a deal with him.
yeah,
Because if he had, then Wilson would have been tainted with
yeah,
association by legitimizing this white rule, I think, in
yeah.
Southern Rhodesia. So I think he escaped that one. I don't think I don't think it damaged him nearly as much as it could have.
No.
Uh,
But I don't think he
Okay,
handled.
so
I mean, do you think he handled anything on foreign policy well? I don't think he did. I mean, he kept Britain out. I don't think, especially he kept Britain out of the Vietnam War rather than
I mean, this is the difference, right? I think Wilson obviously sees the United States as an essential ally,
yeah,
but he's trying to tread a fine line because many strong factions in his own party are not just opposed to Vietnam, but they're opposed to American influence as such.
yeah,
And so, what do you do in that position? That's a very tricky line to walk.
yeah.
Not sure whether Wilson did it very successfully, but
No. Are we going for unsuccessful on these issues?
I guess so. But these are hard. These are really hard situations to manage. I'm actually not quite sure what he could have done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's
Um,
got a hard deal in general. We'll look at the economy next. I think we'll judge him overall when we look at the economic sector because it really should be in there as
yeah.
well. So,
Yes. Sure.
if we look at how successful the economic policies, and we'll just look at them and then judge that, how successful were they, and then we can
Yeah.
judge him on economics as well, and then make an overall judgment of him. I think we need to combine these two essays.
Sure.
So, in looking at how successful the economic policies are under Wilson, you had like I'll look at the national plan first. So obviously the economy was a mess. Like there was not really any way they were going to get out of this situation. Like the macroeconomic situation was bad. Like
So
he inherited a
we're
bad
talking about
situation from Lee
yeah.
Kuan Yew. Yeah.
Can you just specify what you mean by a bad economy? Like just because I have no knowledge of economics.
Stagflation.
So
So inflation was high.
right.
Like
So
unemployment was an issue. Um,
high
productivity was
unemployment.
low,
Yeah.
which is a bad combination. The pound is too strong. We can't export. We got a balance of payments deficit. I mean, there's nothing good in the economy. It's pretty much as bad as you can have it as a base situation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's obviously not working. Like everything that was working in the boom of the 50s when they were riding the wave of the macroeconomic success and America's stimulation of the economy is now out. And they've got to try and get it under control. So he decides to create a new department, the DEA, Department of Economic Affairs, to plan to modernize the British economy. And it's that gives him an election victory in 1966 because he at least looks like he's got a plan. Whereas
This is funny. I think this is quite funny, this what
yeah,
happens for this one.
yeah. So, and then he's obviously saying that, they've talked about 13 wasted years under Macmillan. The Conservatives didn't really have a plan for the economy, that they got lucky, that they didn't do anything, and that's why it's failing. And then he wins the election, which gets him the seats. But ultimately, everything he does is kind of a failure. So, Treasury doesn't cooperate with the DEA, which limits its effectiveness in the first place. And Treasury is being run by Callahan at this point. And the deflationary measures that they bring in undermine it. And the trade unions just refuse to support all the recommendations, which is cutting pay, doing stuff, not allowing pay increases. So everyone just basically ignores it and it dies.
Yeah.
Effectively within 2 years, because whatever Wilson says is just ignored. So again, can you then blame him, or is this? But I suppose you've got two ways. Not really his fault that everyone ignores him, but he is supposed to be the prime minister, supposed to be controlling this stuff, and the DEA doesn't really work at all. And
It's
then he has
funny.
a choice.
This
Yeah,
is a funny one because you could argue it's both successful and unsuccessful depending on your
yeah,
point of view because
yeah,
it helps him win the election.
yeah, which is important. And without
And
the
no matter
election
what
win,
you
he wouldn't
say,
have brought in the
so
social policies.
right. So
Yeah,
it helps it's instrumental in him winning the election, regardless of what the effect is. But the effect is minimal. So
yeah, yeah. So he has a choice between deflation and devaluation because they're the only Keynesian weapons he's got, and no one's thinking of anything new. And
can you just quickly explain what that means and what the implications are? So
so deflation
what's the
is like trying to,
deflation? Yeah.
yeah. So it's getting
So,
yeah, you cut spending and you raise taxes, so it cuts the inflation down. So instead of inflation, you've got prices falling.
yeah. So you make it harder for people to get credit.
Yes, but they've got to pay more
You
tax.
yeah.
And spending on welfare is cut. So poorer people get hit hard by this because they're
Yeah.
paying a higher proportion. But the overall, eventually you're hoping that their purchasing power improves because they don't,
And
because the
yeah.
prices aren't inflating away out of their salaries.
And then there's the other option, and that's devaluation.
Yeah,
So what would that mean?
reducing the strength of the pound. Because if you reduce the strength of the pound, then people can buy our products more. So you can reduce the balance of payments deficit because you're able to sell more products abroad because your products have become cheaper. But then that's a problem for anyone who's importing or for ordinary people because the supermarkets, everything has to pay a lot more to bring any products in. So that is passed on to the consumers.
Yeah, and it smashes your savings too.
Yeah. So both are,
Suddenly the pound, so the pound was worth, if actually remember, somehow remember this, $2.80,
yeah,
$2 US 80.
yeah,
And then it gets, if you devalue it
yeah,
to say $2.40,
yeah,
then you're losing 40 cents
yeah.
um,
And I
in
can,
every pound, so your savings disappear.
yeah.
Well, you have a lot less money than you had before.
Yeah, I've got
Yeah.
a personal story on this. I was traveling in the United States in 2008 when the financial crisis happened. And when I started my holiday, it was $2 to the pound. And 2 months later, it was 1.33. So,
Oh, wow. Okay.
so my holiday was getting exponentially more expensive when I was traveling around. So I have felt the devaluation of the pound literally in my heart. I had to get out and get into Mexico because they hadn't devalued. They devalued as well, so therefore it was still worth something.
That's great.
Yeah, it wasn't voluntary devaluation, that one. That was just a complete collapse of the British economy. But like I can feel this. I've personally felt the pain of going through that. That was mental. America was cheap when I started my holiday, and incredibly expensive when I finished it. And it was only a 2 month holiday. But that's kind of also nuts to think that a currency can lose a third of its value in a month.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, there are countries in the world like Argentina where
Yeah.
that's a kind of day-to-day reality, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. It's
But
getting better,
anyway,
apparently. So that
yeah.
so
So
Wilson's got two shit options. Because
yeah, two shit
despite
up
being an
exactly.
economics professor, he's still minded to just follow the Keynesian because everyone's like Keynesian economics works, even though there's evidence to the contrary at this point. But it's not too much evidence. So they can still be, at this point, it might just be, oh, well, it didn't work under the end of Macmillan's government. But they haven't yet seen the 15 years of crap they're about to go through from 64 to 79 of none of this working. So he's got the option between devaluation and deflation. Now,
And he
devaluation,
chooses so for Wilson, devaluation is not an option. He calls
no.
it the easy way out, doesn't he?
Because it looks weak to the British, and because Attlee had done it, and it had cost Attlee in the 51 election against Churchill. So
Yeah.
the only government that had done it had been Labour. This is only the second real Labour government, and he was like, "Oh my God, if I devalue it, Labour are going to we're going to look incredibly incompetent because it's like both times it's been devalued has been on our watch."
Yeah.
So he's thinking this is not viable. So in the Keynesian economic toolbook of only having two tools to deal with economic problems, he goes, okay, let's do deflation. The problem was it stops the run on the pound in 1966, and it's an easy way out, but it had contributed, like devaluation had contributed to those Labour defeats before. The problem is what really happens is he tries deflation, it doesn't work because then he has to
Yeah.
devalue the pound anyway. So he ends up doing both.
Yeah, that's right.
And
That's
that
right.
doesn't work. So he has to do deflation a second time.
Yeah.
And that just looks awful.
It's just like it's like a really, I don't know if you have an analogy. It's a really terrible situation.
Yeah.
Maybe you're
Yeah.
like a drug addict or
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
and you're just trying to survive the
Yeah.
day
Yeah.
by doing things that in the long run are going to make things worse.
Yeah.
And so you're stuck in this horrible cycle where you're constantly taking short-term measures just to
Yeah.
get through the next day, and then
Yeah.
it's going to get worse and worse cumulatively
Yeah.
until it's just not sustainable anymore. So
This is the economic example of between a rock and a hard place.
yeah,
And
it's pretty
nothing's
bad.
and nothing's working. So like the only problem is these are the two tools of Keynesian economics and neither of them are working. So the logical person in you might think perhaps Keynesian economics isn't working. But like they were just like, no, it must work eventually. Yeah, they had to get bailed out by the Americans, which then comes back to haunt Labour again in the later period when they have to take an IMF loan, which is a massive embarrassment for a big country. So
That's right.
and the Americans only give them money if they maintain their military bases in Asia, which is really weird because they want Britain to be the police force still in Asia. But Britain's obviously after the independence of India is trying to withdraw because you were overstretched.
That sounds very strange because in the Second World War, the US was quite firm. Well, FDR was talking about, that Britain had to leave its colonial assets.
They didn't
That
want
seems like,
colonial assets. They just wanted police. So that to stop
yeah,
communism in
okay.
those areas. They don't
All
want them
right.
to have countries. They want them to have military bases, which is pointless because it's like, what are you protecting over there anymore? Like, and
Yeah.
and Britain is just not in the condition. They can, I mean, look at the economy. It's a mess. They're not in the condition to be running a vast empire of policing states.
Yeah.
The Americans
Okay.
clearly don't want to take over global policeman roles yet, but they're forced to anyway. Obviously, the deflation undermines DEA's national plan. Devaluation reduces the savings of hardworking British people. So again, it's looking like Labour Party is just eroding away your savings. And then they had to do it again and again. So this just looks ugly. There's
Yeah.
some signs of economic recovery by 1970, but again, it looks like another guy. I mean, Wilson came in saying, I'm going to run the economy better than Conservatives, and then looks like he doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
Because if you try
Yeah.
one and then the other and then the first one again, that doesn't fill the voters with confidence that you have a plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or at least
So
it's going to work.
so I'm getting the sense if we go back to the question, how successful were the economic policies in the
Yeah,
64 to 70 Labour government?
yeah.
It's probably easy to say not very successful.
No, no, they're not. Apart from the national plan getting them, the election victory in 66, which is a short-term win. But
But
overall,
they lose. They're going to lose in 1970.
yeah, it's a mess.
Ah,
The party's divided
so
again by 70. The economy is a mess. You know what I mean? They're in apart from the social
yeah.
policies, and even the social policies backfire because obviously that leads to Powell's rivers of blood speech and other stuff, which cost them in
Do you
70.
think that if you could you make a solid case for the contrary that Wilson was successful with
Overall,
economic
you reckon?
policies? Yeah.
Economically, go on then, make the case
Mm.
that Wilson
No,
is.
I'm asking you. I don't want to do
Uh,
it.
I think the only way you can make the case is that it just was such a mess that it's not really
Yeah.
him. It's the overall economic model is not working anymore and getting
Yeah, that's right.
progressively
You could,
worse.
yeah,
It's bad under the end of Macmillan. It's worse under Wilson. It's worse under Heath, and it's even worse under Callaghan.
exactly. Yeah. So there's a greater force at play here.
Yeah,
It's not like Wilson's able to control all of
yeah,
these factors. He's trying to mitigate them. And if you're going to make a case for his successful,
mm.
if that his successful management, you could say that, well, at least he mitigates the worst effects of it. He could have done worse.
Yeah. There was
And
apparently some degree of economic recovery just before 1970, so it was kind of like recovering a little bit. But I still don't necessarily think that any of the prime ministers know what they're doing. I think it's just what's happening in the macro economy is just buffeting Britain. Britain's like a piddly little boat with no oar, no engine, no sail, just bouncing around in the ocean of world economies. I
yeah,
think it's
yeah,
like
yeah.
so overall, how are we going to rate Wilson for a successful overall? How would you judge
Yes,
Wilson overall as a prime minister?
that's hard. I think you could go either way on this,
Yeah,
depending on what you want to emphasize. I think if you want to argue in favor of Harold Wilson, I'd go for the emphasize the social policies.
yeah,
Um, if you wanted to argue against it, I would emphasize the foreign colonial issues,
yeah,
um,
and economics.
the failure to manage the unions successfully, and then the failure to really be able to control effectively the inflation.
Yeah, I would. I think if
Um,
we were doing a how effective Wilson one, I think I would use, like I said, I think in hindsight, when I really need to reorder this essay pack, because I think putting economic in as the third factor makes more sense, and having like the
yeah,
overall control of the Labour Party as a secondary one.
yes, yeah,
Because with
yeah,
every prime minister, you have to be able to judge them because you can be asked how successful they were in general, how successful they were economically or socially. So it's more
yes,
narrow.
exactly,
They
yeah,
tend to do essay questions on all of those, and then like why did someone win elections? So it's always those questions. There's not much like variety in these in the questions that pop up in exams on the written paper. To be absolutely honest. Um,
okay,
so
all right,
I think I would say he was success. I think you can argue he was successful socially, successful for the country socially, not necessarily for the Labour Party because the backlash cost them. I think in this
right,
election. I think that he was initially successful at holding his party together, but by 1970 he was making missteps, like over Vietnam and in place of strife that cost him that election. I would
but
say
again, James, I'd ask you what could he have done better with Vietnam? Like he's dealt
not
a really bad
not
hand.
public. I don't think he needed to publicly
Uh,
support it.
okay.
then I think that would have been okay. Because if he'd have just said, no, I'm not supporting it, I'm not sending troops, I think the left would have been all right.
But then there'd be consequences from the US,
Yeah, but there were consequences
as you
anyway.
point
They
out.
forced, because they had to lend us money, they had to
Yeah, and he's
keep the
borrowing money
bases
from the
out.
US.
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't think there would have been, I don't think the consequences of the US for not going to Vietnam. You know what I mean? As long as you didn't publicly oppose it, I don't think you needed to come out and publicly support it. I think they could have just stayed silent. Just if you think, if
Okay.
you're doing a comparison, France and Germany didn't join in Kosovo, for example, or Iraq and Afghanistan. Oh, Iraq rather. They were in Afghanistan. I don't think there were really any major consequences other than people renaming chips freedom fries, instead of French fries.
Yeah.
But I don't think there were any major consequences, for France and Germany for not entering those. I don't think Britain would have faced any massive consequences of not going into Vietnam.
Okay.
But I mean,
Right.
I could be wrong, but I just don't think they would have, and certainly not to the point where it would have been, so terrible if they hadn't done it.
Okay.
Okay,
All
cool.
right.
Let's end.
Possibly.
I think
Yep.
we'll end on that to make it a nice clean break, unlike last time where we went off.
Done.